Well, both Radio New Zealand and the New Zealand Herald and One News, all independent media apparently, carried the exact same story last week. Yep, actually we could lose two of those three outlets and still have got this news, which says something about whether we need all the mainstream outlets. But anyway, this must have been a very important news item because a significant pet project of Jacinda Ardern's has just been ingloriously shut down. So, with all this coverage, hopefully we'll get a number of media angles from a number of journalists critiquing what has happened in your dreams. But here's the key bit of the story. Jacinda's white extremism project has been closed down because it's run by a white extremist. So the same report in all three major news outlets, and it said this: the government has pulled funding from the country's flagship research centre into violent extremism, and it's headed "It's a broken promise." Set up as a response to the Royal Commission on the 2019 Christchurch mosque attacks, its short-lived existence has been called a broken promise and a threat to minorities. He Whenua Taurikura Research Centre in Wellington received a letter from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet on Friday saying funding would end in December. It has been run under a trust since 2022. A trust spokesman told RNZ, members of the trust are disappointed with the sudden change in direction by the government done in the name of cost savings. The $2 million the government saves by cutting this research will almost certainly increase the risk of significant loss of an innocent life in vulnerable communities at the hands of extremists. A trust spokesperson said its demise would absolutely leave a gap of research into white extremism. Yep, so apparently all extremism is as a result of white people. Well, more correctly, as Green MP Marama Davidson told us, cis white males who are responsible for all the violence in the world. Now, look, let's be clear. Nobody wants to ever see again what we saw in 2019 at those mosques. Never again. But what the media didn't tell you, conveniently, is the real reason that the group targeting white extremism was closed down. It was headed by an extremist who was white. Classic. Yep. So here's the launch of the research centre in 2022, New Zealand's National Centre of Research Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism.
We're here at Parliament today. We've just launched a new National Centre of Research Excellence called He Whenua Taurikura, Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism.
Well, the hope is that I think we will be able to establish a database, an evidence base, which tells us what's happening in our communities, what's happening that's good in those communities, but also what is a challenge. So what is it that is producing some of the extremism and violent extremism that we've seen?
For me, the answers to violent extremism and terrorism lie within our people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as we, in the aftermath of March 15, were searching for the answers of how we could prevent this from ever happening again, it became clear that a New Zealand-specific lens would be required. So we're starting here, building our own answers, and hopefully that will be of use to the world.
It enables our community and other faith-based and ethnic communities, as well as the rainbow communities, the disability and others, to actually say, hey, look, we count in New Zealand. Our issues and our problems needs to be factored in the whole scope of national security. And this also enables some of our young people. They can participate in research so that otherness is going away and bringing in the us approach.
We're living in really uncertain times at the moment, and we need to create an evidence base that helps us to understand some of the things that are going wrong in our society. So what He Whenua Taurikura is going to be doing is bringing together scholars from communities, from academia, from government, to really look at some of the wicked problems that we're dealing with in terms of social violence and work towards social cohesion.
Yes, now it was lovely that the Islamic Association rep was able to mention rainbow communities, sort of as an afterthought almost, in that list of groups falling prey to white extremism. Just wondering, does anyone know what the attitude of Islam is to homosexuality? But look, it's about violent extremism, but not all violent extremism, just the white kind. Now, you'll note that the head of the unit, a Professor Joanna Kidman, says that the purpose of the unit is to counter, quote, social violence and work towards social cohesion, end quote. That was her at the end of the video. So let's check out the glorious socially cohesive work of Professor Kidman. And here are some of her socially cohesive tweets. There's some doozies. Here she is accusing a New Zealand Herald senior reporter of being drunk. Is that an example of white extremism that must be extinguished? Why did this reporter feel the wrath of Professor Kidman? Well, she wrote a column entitled "The COVID Elimination Strategy is like a bad breakup. We need to get over it." And this was back in 2021. And she said, "It's tempting to go into a mini lockdown of your own making, but try to resist the urge. Like many relationships, our relationship with the elimination strategy did not last a distance, and a clean break is almost always best. We're living with COVID now." Okay, so basically she's questioning, does the elimination strategy work? And we know that it didn't. But how dare she speak up for the plight of the hospitality industry in Wellington after a chaotic year? How dare she challenge the science? How dare this reporter challenge COVID policy? I mean, yes, even in March of 2021, when we knew so much more about who was really at risk than what we did when it first arrived in March 2020. Now, interestingly, this journalist won a prestigious award for her coverage of the Me Too movement in New Zealand, but she's challenging the science, or more correctly, Professor Kidman's understanding of the science. So according to our professor, who was against white extremism, remember, our Me Too movement champion journalist is a white extremist. Now, in an attack on her fellow academics, she tweeted about a statue of Sir George Grey in Auckland. She said, "Nice example of historian as bigoted dickhead, to add to the pile of 12 million reasons why 99% of university historians should have a curfew and an ankle tracker." Wow. She wants a fellow female academic locked up, and that's a journalist commenting below there. This from a professor, utterly disgraceful. Memo to Indigenous Self, calling out racism in academia is to run into a wall of white men and other shuffling zombies interrupted from grazing on 800 years of white supremacy in the paddocks of the white ivory tower. This is a charmer. Duncan Garner is a F-wit. That's my academic opinion. Well, there's some very good academic prowess from our director of our anti-extremist centre that's just been sacked. Here's another one. "Am so sick of smug beep stories about how to make meals on a shoestring. To get all the beep ingredients, you need more money set aside for your weekly food spent than most families have right now. F right off, you beep sanctimonious middle-class gits." Wow. She sounds like she needs a cup of tea and a lie down. Fancy encouraging families to budget, save money and make great meals without breaking the bank. Yeah, I know, shocking. But here's the doozy one, and this was a recent one in response to those boot camps which the government has introduced to try and turn around the lives of at-risk youth. You know, those shockingly mean, nasty boot camps which include sports and team building, sleep hygiene and nutrition, mentoring, daily journaling, visiting maraes and churches, going to museums, CV writing, dressing to a standard, growing food, emotional regulation and coping strategies. Yeah, shocking. Well, Professor Kidman thinks these are just hating on children. She tweeted this: "There is so much evidence that military-style youth boot camps don't work and are expensive that I can only assume that this government, which pays my wages, hates children. Most of all, whom will be poor and brown. Plus it wants to snatch children's lunches. Is this a government or a death cult?" Well, this tweet hasn't aged well, has it? I mean, especially after last week and the government unveiling its school lunches, which is going to save more than $130 million a year, which can be put into maybe health and education. And the food includes butter chicken curry, chicken katsu, lasagna, chicken pasta, salad and wraps at a cost of $3 each. I mean, wow, fancy serving that up to children. The government must really hate children. And wouldn't calling the government a death cult that hates children actually inspire violent extremism? So who is this Dr. Kidman? And now, I'm grateful to Chris Lynch Media, a very good news website that's sprung up. He did a very good profile 2 years ago. And he tells us that Professor Dr. Joanna Kidman and Professor Paul Spoonley, who you would have seen in that promo video, they were appointed as co-directors of the centre, but Spoonley was only for 1 year, while Dr. Kidman's term is 3 years. Was 3 years. Now, Dr. Kidman is a professor of Māori education at Victoria University of Wellington, is a sociologist researching Indigenous sociology, Māori youth, higher education, decolonisation studies and comparative education. Now, interestingly, even left-wing commentators thought that Jacinda's and Justice Minister at the time, Andrew Little, so both of them were involved in setting this up. You would have seen them at the video. That Jacinda's appointment was a terrible choice. I mean, left-leaning political commentator Chris Trotter, who you may have heard of, said it was a very disturbing appointment. He said, "I consider Kidman to be an extremist." While left-leaning political blogger Martin Bradbury described the appointment as insane. And he wrote on his blog, let me just find it for you. He wasn't happy. He said, "Labor have been pushed back on their hate speech madness, but are still trying to find new ways to restrict free speech, meaning this new extreme research academy will have vast influence over very large powers, which brings us to the problematic appointment of Professor Kidman. The good professor was the one who called out and started the woke cancellation of dressmaker Trelise Cooper for a dress called the Trail of Tears." Now, do you remember this story? Now, the Trail of Tears, which is tears as in rows or layers, placed one above the other, but Kidman argued that it was Trail of Tears, tears as in crying, which was the genocidal forced march of 46,000 Native Americans between 1830 and 1850 by the United States federal government. Yes, so Kidman got very upset and said, that it was the height of total insensitivity, despite the complete removal, Trail of Tears versus Trail of Tears. Anyway, Bradbury, left-wing Bradbury, says, "Hands up who thinks for 1 second that Trelise Cooper had any idea whatsoever what the Trail of Tears was or intended to culturally appropriate a genocidal forced march. Kidman wanted Cooper cancelled for a dress. That's her threshold for hate and extremism. A dressmaker who had no idea of an Indigenous atrocity. That's the person in charge of an academy on extremism, someone who is triggered by a dress and who used their platform to start a woke lynch mob. Anything coming out of this extremism research centre must be challenged." Good point. Chris Lynch's report also highlighted that Professor Kidman was one of the signatures on the open letter that attacked the Listener 7. Now, do you remember the academics who penned the In Defence of Science piece, which claimed that while Indigenous knowledge, Maturanga Māori, is important, it falls below what can be defined as science itself. Now, for their involvement in the listener letter, 2 professors were harassed for months. And in 2020, during the height of the Black Lives Movement in the United States, Kidman wrote in a now deleted tweet. In fact, after her appointment, she hid her Twitter account, which is always a red flag as to the controversy of what they really believe. But she wrote this: "White academia, you've discovered racism this past fortnight and taken to the streets in support of BLM. Now it's time to turn your attention to the saturating whiteness of your own universities, disciplines and teaching the research practices, and recognise your own complicity." Wow. Chris Lynch's report also highlighted that in 2020, Kidman encouraged a petition calling out Waikato University as being guilty of structural racism. Although an independent review into allegations concluded the claims were incorrect, inaccurate, and reflective of differing perspectives. Now, as well as that, the centre has apparently funded some hard left activists, including Emi Rakiri. Here's some examples of his posts. Oh, that's a charming one, isn't it? Charming. Here's another one. Yep, he doesn't want people to be called pedophiles. He wants to change the language on that. Here's another one. Oh, celebrating that the Prime Minister's office has been vandalised 3 times, probably because the Prime Minister is white. And retweeting this one, F the colony. Yep, a real charmer. Ironically, he's a criminology lecturer at Auckland University. Perhaps he should check the criminality of wanting to cut someone up. Now, this White Extremism Research Centre has also funded other names like Byron Clark and Kyle Matthews, both radical leftist activists, and Kate Hanna. Yes, this Kate Hanna, who's just had her disinformation unit shut down because of disinformation.
What is known internationally as the kind of trad wife set of viewpoints, which is white, Christian, a lot of pseudo-Celtic, pseudo-Nordic ideologies behind it. They use Pinterest and Instagram to draw in other women who are interested in interior design, children's clothing, knitting, healthy food for children.
And
it does
white.
draw people in towards a set of white nationalist ideas. I mean, it's relatively easy to see. If you see a very beautiful, fair-skinned, blonde or red-haired child with beautiful braiding in her hair and some flowers, just step back a little bit.
Just step back a little bit. Now, as Chris Lynch concluded in his piece, we already have the ability to counter violent extremism because we actually have the, the NZSIS. And on that website, it says there are individuals and groups in New Zealand that are committed to acts of terrorism, violence and intimidation. These are extremists who advocate using violence to impose their own political, ethnic or religious viewpoint on others. So this is New Zealand SIS. It is important to note that terrorism can occur at the extremes of any ideology, cause or belief system. As such, the NZSIS may investigate any individual, group or entity that advocates violence in support of an ideology. Wow, what a great approach. Targeting all terrorism and extremism, not just the white kind. Now, finally, here's the interesting bit. So remember the fawning coverage of the closure of this white extremist centre and how disastrous the decision was? You know, the coverage that was in the New Zealand Herald, Radio NZ and One News. Well, guess how many times Professor Joanne Kidman's was mentioned in the article? I mean, it's quite relevant, eh? It's her baby. She's the boss. How many times? Zilch. Not once. In fact, even Jacinda Ardern wasn't mentioned. It was just about the mean, nasty government who had broken their promise. But they had never made a promise to keep this flawed extremist centre going. So what the government did last week was simply remove a white extremist and an organisation countering white extremism. it was the perfect decision to follow on from the axing of the disinformation project. Good riddance to both of them.